Hello, my name is Serene Tefaha. I'm a solicitor based in Melbourne, Victoria. My practice is Advocate Me, and we're currently running a number of class actions in relation to the directives that have recently been made by the states and the territories. I am appalled by the actions of Deputy Chief Health Officer Dr. Annalise Van Diemen, the Premier Daniel Andrews, and the Victorian Police Commissioner Shane Patton in backing and sponsoring these appalling detention directives that have been issued on the most vulnerable members of our community. These are called detention directives, and under the law, it is extremely concerning to detain someone without having the right circumstances and the prerequisites before detainment. Now, we say that the residents of the following residences are being unlawfully detained, which could lead to the common law tort called false imprisonment. These residences are 12 Sutton Street, North Melbourne, 33 Alfred Street, North Melbourne, 76 Canning Street, North Melbourne, 159 Melrose Street, North Melbourne, 9 Pampas Street, North Melbourne, 12 Holland Court, Flemington, and 120, 126 and 130 Racecourse Road, Flemington. The only circumstances or situations where public authorities can detain people lawfully are the following: a person sentenced by a court to serve a term of imprisonment for committing an offence, police arresting suspected offenders, hospitals or doctors detaining people who are mentally ill, and immigration detention. We say that none of these categories fit within the requirements that have been imposed on people of these residences unlawfully. Indeed, you are not being arrested for being a suspected offender. Now, the Premier, Daniel Andrews, and the Deputy Chief Health Officer seem to be relying on the Public Health and Wellbeing Act of Victoria to suggest that somehow they can do that. However, that act itself does not allow and does not validate the steps that they have taken. And in fact, that act needs to be looked at in the context of the greater jurisdiction that applies here, and that is the Commonwealth jurisdiction. And that is the Biosecurity Act. The Biosecurity Act came in 2015, and it clearly provides the circumstances and the reasons when detention can happen before you can even detain someone. It sets up certain requirements. It's extremely clear from the legislation at Section 103 of the Biosecurity Act that an individual needs to be provided that opportunity first through a biosecurity control order or a personal direction to tell them that they need to remain in a particular place or in isolation because they personally present a contagion risk, that they personally pose a significant risk to public health. This is extremely significant. You can't just go and detain a group of people without, first of all, providing them the right steps and protocols before individually letting them know where the concerns are, before identifying them individually and saying that you pose a serious public health risk. You don't just huddle people together and detain them without the appropriate protocols. Indeed, that is called false imprisonment. None of the laws of the federal have been applied or put into this process. Furthermore, people were not even issued a warning, even at the state level. You need to provide people a warning, you need to provide them in writing, you need to identify the individuals that are involved, and you need to identify whether there is legitimately a serious public health risk. Let's talk about this. Let's talk about why the Victorian Government has done this. Well, they say that the testing is a sufficient mechanism to tell them that there is a serious public health risk. Well, let's look at what the government's websites, let's see the regulatory bodies, what they have to say about this alleged testing that is actually showing an infectious rate that is increasing, which is an absolute preposterous suggestion and highly unscientific. Well, let's turn to the TGA. the Therapeutic Goods Administrators. And what do they say about these COVID-19 PCR tests? Well, they say the reliability of COVID-19 tests is uncertain due to limited evidence base. Available evidence mainly comes from symptomatic patients, and their clinical role in detecting asymptomatic carriers is unclear. Indeed, you need to identify that risk on an individual who's posing symptomatic risk. These tests do not tell you whether someone is infectious or is asymptomatic. Indeed, the government, Australian Department of Health, also says PCR tests cannot distinguish between live virus and non-infective RNA. The FDA states in the US, since we just love to follow what the US does, the detection of viral RNA by RT-PCR does not necessarily equate with an infectious virus. Indeed, the more surveillance that you do on a healthy population, the more likely you will have cases, because coronaviruses represent 7 to 15% of respiratory viruses, and the tests are not identifying the whole RNA virus because they cannot purify a whole natural RNA virus. So there's even a risk of saying that the deaths that have died have been 100% correlated to COVID-19. This is from their own websites. This is from their own information. It's time for us to really question these lockdowns and the basis of these alleged state of emergency powers and the identification of serious public health risks. Now we know so much about how this virus operates. We know that it actually attacks blood clots or causes blood clots in the blood vessels of the lungs rather than creating a pneumonia-like infection in the lungs. We know that that's been elevated by aspirin and heparin. We know that oxygen saturation is something to be monitored and continued, and we have stopped and in many cases suspended deaths in these scenarios through appropriate use of antivirals and steroids to prevent what is known as a cytokine storm. We know this. We also know that there are so many epidemiologists and scientists and thinkers and Nobel Prize winners who are all saying that the lockdown and the emergency state powers are unlawful and are illegitimate. And what does the state of Victoria do? Rely on this to go and detain the most vulnerable people in this country. What does the police do when they know? Is there not one police officer who doesn't understand the laws that they apply? That you can't detain an individual without reasonable cause of offending. And yet you got the police, 500 of them, who just all come down. I mean, there's no surprise. We are talking about Victoria Police after all, unfortunately. And we all know that power tripping is part of their equation. So there isn't really one police officer who's gone up and said no. There isn't one reasonable member of parliament who's getting up there and saying no. This is an outrage. You can't detain individuals without proper protocols and processes first. I mean, we've got 100 years of law in this country that says you can't do that. It's called false imprisonment. We're asking for all of the residents that I have already mentioned of Flemington and North Melbourne to come to sign up. I'm doing this on a no-win, no-fee basis. I am so confident about the case that we have. We will be seeking compensation for you for your lack of dignity that you have suffered as a result. And in this state, we also have the Human Rights Act. In this state, about your freedom of movement, about not being treated in a degrading and inhumane manner. And it sounds, I mean, what are they doing? Are they running a social experiment, a drill of some sort? I mean, really, what is this for? But in any case, irrespective of the true motivator, this is an outrageous display of power and one that must be stopped. As I said, it is on a no-win, no-fee basis. I've put all of the links for you, the forms to be filled. I've given you all the strategy, the information. Please pass it on to the residents of these buildings. Please pass it on to them. And I've also attached a donation account. There will be 100% transparency. If you do donate, we will give you monthly updates of how we're spending this money and on who. Everything will be transparent. We need to put a stop to this. This is about people's rights, people's dignity. And if it starts with this, where else is it going to go? So I look forward to everyone joining on and passing it on, and let's stop this.